It is a great honor to welcome Professor Timothy Patitsas to this podcast. He is the Dean of Hellenic College in Brookline, Massachusetts, and the Assistant Professor of Ethics at the affiliated Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology. And today we're discussing a segment from his wonderful book, The Ethics of Beauty. Tim, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm glad to spend this time with you.
Yeah, and it's been a long time coming. I first got to know you through Roger, who has become a good friend, and yeah, he had a entry in his blog, this is diary, where he interviews you in regards to the book, and that's how I came to know the book. And yeah, once I got into contact with you, you asked me to request a copy of the book in the library. Now it has arrived. I've read much of it, and I enjoyed every page of it. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay, so for this hour, I'd like to focus on the sixth chapter of the book. It is titled "The Mystical Architect: The Conception of the Crucified Logos in Art, Science, and Nature." But I would first like to begin by addressing, I suppose, the unique format of the book. It is structured as a series of very long interviews between yourself and the journal, The Road to Emmaus.
Yes.
So tell me about how the book came to adopt the form that it did.
So there of course, Road to Emmaus is a common cultural theme in Christianity, because of Luke and Cleopas. Cleopas were journeying from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and they unwittingly spoke with Christ. And I mean, everyone knows that story from the Gospels. But there's a journal called Road to Emmaus, the Orthodox Journal of Art and Culture, which has been going strong for over 25 years. And all of its articles are interviews with, it's kind of a folk history of contemporary Orthodox Christianity. And the genius and the force behind that magazine is a nun from San Diego, Mother Nectaria McLeese. She lives these days in Indiana and sometimes abroad, and she was at the convent, at the monastery in Kodiak, on Spruce Island when it was a convent many years ago. So she's seen a lot of the world and kept this magazine going. So she became a student here at Holy Cross. So she was one of my students, and she did another interview with me where she recorded, she asked questions. And then she asked me to do another one about the Orthodox Christian teaching on war, on combat. And I decided that it would be simpler if I just wrote the questions and the answers. So the first three chapters were like that. I wrote the questions and the answers with not as much feedback from Mother Nectaria, because they were all published first, going back to like 2012 in the magazine. But in 2014, when I sat down to do chapters, the rest of the book, I just kept that format. I kept sort of posing questions and answering them as if I were in this back and forth. Now, once I'd finished all 8 chapters, then Mother Nectaria and I went back, and it was a many-year process of editing. And she asked additional questions. She asked for clarifications. So most chapters are about twice as long as they would have been. Maybe that's too detailed an answer, but essentially, having done one interview like that, I liked the format. And for this book, initially, I was just, interviewing myself.
I see. Okay. Now, my curiosity in reading the book is, so my background is that I'm a recently converted Catholic Christian. I know a good deal about the brand of Christianity, so to speak, that I'm affiliated with. I know somewhat about Protestantism because I my discipline is American studies, and I think in order to know America, you kind of have to know Protestant Christianity to some extent. But Orthodox Christianity is something that I'm completely uh, unknown of. Like it is something that I would like to know a lot more. And the book, of course, is a masterful ex exploration of what Orthodox theology mean. Um, uh, I recently traveled to Greece, Thessaloniki, and I had a chance to visit quite a few of the churches there. And one of the things I noticed in the fellow Greek churchgoers is that whenever they pass by a church, they would cross themselves, and I think that is something quite miraculous. So I'd like to hear from you. How would you compare the Orthodox tradition to that of the Catholic?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I guess, being an academic, I might answer that in a more roundabout way than, sort of like, say, an internet polemicist or even an evangelist would. I my One of my great influences in my academic life is the late Jane Jacobs, the urbanist. I met her, we were friends. My dissertation was broadly speaking about her work. There's a lot of influence there. And one of her themes later in life is the way in which civilizations can enter a dark age or emerge from a dark age or stave off dark ages. And dark ages are characterized in particular by, kind of mass forgetting, like things people knew how to do, or things that our ancestors knew how to do, we just don't know. And and then the other great characteristic of dark ages is the death of vibrant cities, the way cities kind of vanish from the landscape, and economic life and cultural life and, excuse me, social life is much more rudimentary. So this process of remembering, of forgetting, of staving off forgetting, and uh, is it's perennial, and it's everywhere in all civilizations. Um, a few years ago, I think NPR did something on the United States was trying to renew its nuclear arsenal, constructed hastily in the 50s and 60s, to great. And they discovered a lot of the aspects of the technology. No one knew how they were designed. I mean, just in a few decades, it was forgotten. People say that the Saturn V rocket, that NASA didn't keep any blueprints for the rocket. Those are lost. So remembering and forgetting is a constant theme. Now, Orthodoxy, sometimes called, the Eastern Orthodoxy. The idea is that the Dark Ages that hit Central and Western Europe didn't hit Eastern Europe for much longer, for another, several centuries or even 1,000 years. So the argument is that there's some kind of unbroken continuity. Now, in my case, for my book, for the Ethics of Beauty, what I'm after is a continuity that goes back to the classical period and back to so like, fourth, fifth, sixth century BC Athens, and then 1,000 or more years beyond past that. And the great insight that the Greeks picked up from, whether it was the Babylonians or the Egyptians or both, is this threefold way of knowing. And that is the rightful inheritance of the human race. And the purpose of my book is to recover that as explicitly as possible and as practically as possible in realms like psychology, theology, different things. And then this older understanding of what knowing is, I think, has been confirmed in the work of Ian McGilchrist. and his book, The Master and His Emissary, where he also describes a threefold process. That's what the trivium was. That trivium is in the Philokalia, the Eastern Handbook of Mysticism. Um, so so I didn't really answer your question, but that's what I'm about, is trying to recover that deepest strand that we have of what it means to know and show why it was the right approach.
I see. Yeah. You mentioned Jane Jacobs, who, again, up until reading your book, I was not too familiar with. I really should. She has a great book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities.
Yes.
And I do understand also that while she was doing her life and work, she came up against a very powerful opponent, and that being Robert Moses. That
Yeah.
is someone that I'm a little bit more familiar with. I'm in the process of working through that magnificent and mega biography of his, The Power Broker. Robert Caro was not flattering about Moses at all, even though he had something to praise about him. But in overall, he criticized Moses's almost messianic version of city design. He saw the city of New York in blueprints and models, while I suppose Jane Jacobs saw New York differently. So how did he see it? How did she see New York?
Well, I mean, the language I use in the book is that applied to this case would be that Jane Jacobs had a beauty first approach to knowledge, and and that Robert Moses had what I would call a truth first, um, or it styles itself as a kind of truth first approach. And um, the the reason the death and life of great American cities is important for everyone to read is not only because it's the best book ever written about city design, but because in its final chapter, Jane Jacobs asks, she turns the matter directly to science, and she says, she titles the chapter, "What Kind of a Problem the City Is." And she quotes a guy named Warren Weaver, who most moderns have not heard of, but he was a pivotal person in the history of contemporary science. And in 1957, he wrote his valedictory address at the Rockefeller Foundation. He was there, had been there for the previous 25 years. And he summarized in a few short words the history of modern science, and saying that as 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 a species, as knowers, as scientists, we had come to realize that there were three distinct kinds of scientific problem in the world, in nature, and possible, and um, that we need all three. And essentially, what's happening in the death and life of great American cities is, um, you get this glimpse of Robert Moses, and I mean, he was just there were thousands and thousands of people just like him. I mean, he was only unique for his impact, not for his certainly not for his thought. Um, who saw the city as a kind of statistical problem, resolvable to problems in simplicity, two variable problems. And Jacobs came back and said, no, actually, the city is more like a biological problem. It's a problem in organized complexity. So I don't know if that's boring to your listeners. I hope not. It's absolutely fundamental. Education should a primary purpose of education after the death and life of great American cities should have been to teach children, adults, everyone who's what the three kinds of problems there are, and then what each one is good for. And for living systems, you need the problems in organized complexity approach.
I see. Now, One of the other great figures that you mentioned in the chapter is Wendell Berry, the great agrarian poet,
Yes.
novelist, philosopher, writer. And I think the interviewer of Road to Emmaus also mentioned this too, but Wendell Berry and Jane Jacobs seems to be very different people. One is a city
Yeah.
lady and the other is a rural man. Um, and that brings me to, one of the perennial themes of conflict that in American society that is rarely addressed, even today, is that the conflict between the urbanites and the ruralites, I suppose, the farmers. And I wonder, what do you find in common, which is in common between Jacobs and Barry?
They both, they both have a powerful aesthetic sense, and it guides them. They both are opposed to this problems in disorganized complexity, what we call, another name for these statistical problems, reducible to problems in simplicity approach. Sometimes it seems like the whole of contemporary science is a conspiracy. It's sort of an act of willful self-blindness to imagine that only those two kinds of problems exist and ignore the emergent problems, the living systems. And so both of them prefer living systems. Both of them understand that a sense of aesthetics is is I mean, you can't do without it when it comes to understanding the health of a living system. And both of them are committed moralists. Both of them have a very strong moral sense and a social moral sense. Now, Jane Jacobs is the better thinker, without a doubt. And she's seen more fundamentally. She's thinking about thinking in a way that is just more readily translatable. Like as I said, she took the Warren Weaver report. She just saw right away, that's what was going on. That the people prescribing for American cities and British cities and French housing projects, that they were all using the wrong kind of science, right? So that's very important to state that. Like, this is not as she said, I'm not hair splitting about fashion. I'm not quibbles about design. Those are quotes from her very first, paragraph. This is a fundamental intellectual mistake to view a living system like the city through the lens of science that is appropriate to dead or mechanical systems. So, but where's Barry better than Jacobs? He's a more a larger proportion of what he writes is about morality and moralism, and he brings a fine aesthetic sense to it. I never regret reading Barry. Um, I, I I try every chance I get to pick something up and go at it. But he ultimately he has no answers because he doesn't understand the origin of, he doesn't know what economics is, and Jacobs does. So he's great, but he's only and has an ancillary, or complementary benefit.
Mhm. Yeah.
Jane Jacobs was the most important social thinker of the 20th century. And because we are social beings, I would say she was the most important intellectual of the 20th century. And I know no one else is going to say that, and then they would, pick Einstein or someone like that. I no, she was the person, she caught the tiger by the tail and she figured it all out.
Mhm. Yes. So going back to my point about the divide between the rural and the urban, I
Yes.
wonder, is the origin of this divide stems from this perceived difference in ethical code between those who live in cities and those who live on farms and such?
I mean, what Jacobs points out is that cities invent and reinvent the rural world, and they do it with no pushback, unless the only thing that can kind of stop a city is another city. I mean, yes, there can be uprisings and rebellions, but this is a temporary kind of very blunt instrument. Um, so, so because cities invent and reinvent the rural world, to city people anywhere in the world, non-city people don't, they're not to be taken fully seriously. They're not, either they're romanticized in some weird way, or they're dismissed. It's in America now, it's flyover country is the non-city space, or it's a Trump voter. But um, but this is politically and socially dangerous if the city dwellers of your country lose all sympathy or understanding of the non-city people in their own nation.
Yes. I'm
And
reminded.
then rural people resent the fact that their lives, seen principally through economics, but also through culture, are being invented and reinvented by these city elites. So it's a natural kind of tension that's built into human life.
Yes. Yeah, I'm reminded of this, the title of a political book that came out in recent times, like a White Rural Rage, a threat to America or American democracy or whatever. And it was obviously written by two Democrats or Democrat leaning uh, academics. And it's a far cry from, I suppose, the Democratic Party of the late 19th, early 20th century. Well, I'm doing my thesis, my master's thesis on the 1896 election, and I find William Jennings Bryan to be an absolutely fascinating figure. He's a Democrat, and he spoke for religious people and rural people against uh, what he deemed to be a plutocratic interest of the North, of the Republicans, of the merchant class, and you can imagine how out of step he would be in contemporary the contemporary Democratic Party. And and Bryan, I think, it's not only one of the most significant political figures of American history, but he's also one of the most poetic of American political figures. And I wonder, to what extent does the does rural living of the kind that Wendell Berry experiences and elegizes about provide grounds for such poetry?
Um, I, I I think it was Amy Chua who wrote a book called World on Fire,
Yeah, yeah.
and it was you know it, it was kind of a simple book in a sense. It just made a simple observation, which was that the West was pushing in the 90s, the Washington elite, the Washington consensus was pushing for the whole world globalization economically and democracy politically. And she just pointed out that in many countries, globalization would empower the commercial elites, whereas democracy would empower sort of the broad base of economically disenfranchised people. So she predicted a kind of, war. That's all you're looking at in the United States. Democratically, um, you know, it kind of defies belief that Biden got more votes than Obama. It's not impossible, but it does seem like democratically, you know, the uh, the force of the nation is for Trump, but commercial elites who are dependent on certain kind of predictable, international relationships, sort of the so-called globalist elite, they of course, are going to vote for someone like Biden. And but that is not like an American thing or something, and it has nothing to do really with rage or ruralness or anything else. It has to do more with um, the ways in which, in a globalized economic system, the stakes of winner takes all are much bigger. So you're going to have, an ever narrower economic elite and then just the average person somehow sensing that this isn't about them anymore. And then the way for the elites to overcome that is to provoke rage, to to pit the races against each other, or to pit suburban versus rural. And so they are manufacturing the rage, um, in order to sustain those elite positions. I don't really blame them, however. I think that if Jane Jacobs is correct, then all contemporary economic systems are untenable. And that is because um, you need the only firewall against cities inventing and reinventing you is to have your own cities. And the only way to have your own city is to have your own currency, your own interest rate, your own exchange rate. And of course, with William Jennings Bryan, you can see that in silver and all this kind of thing. Or now, since the Federal Reserve was founded, fiat money or whatever, everyone's kind of groping, kind of clumsily. But the issue is local currencies. Without that, you have a system that's always going to be teetering on a kind of collapse.
Mhm. You know,
Yeah, and then of course the funny thing is, the irony of it all is when everything points to this, the need for local currencies, the poor Europeans. I mean, 1914 is no surprise. I mean, they are. It's like a continent of lemmings. How in the world did they sleepwalk into that war, into the next war, and how did they sleepwalk into the euro? And they had all those national currencies giving local vibrancy and color, and they threw that away, and now essentially everyone's on the Deutschmark, but recast as the euro. But really, they should have gone the other direction. They should have not eliminated currencies. They should have multiplied them.
yeah, and yeah, on that topic, I think Hungary, the country that I'm currently sitting in,
Yes.
is one of the few outliers in the world of I guess currency. The wider European continent uses the euro. Hungary uses the forint. I believe Czech Republic uses another currency different from the euro as well. Um, but yeah, you mentioned a really good point about globalization. One of my favorite thinkers is the media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who came up with the phrase "the global village." So he was saying this during the 50s and 60s. So in certain ways, he may have predicted the rise of globalization. And he was not entirely optimistic about this development in global affairs, because he thought that this as the process of globalization expand, there will be movements that are either politically or socially or culturally react against it in um, very radical ways, or in some instances violent ways. You see, I
But
suppose
but
it's
but but that's but I think that's wrong. I mean, in other words, the issue is not culture, it's not ethics, it's not religion. The issue is firewalls.
Mhm.
And we're trying to build a complex system with no firewalls. Everyone knows that can't work. So why are we doing it? And and besides, it wasn't McLuhan, it was Karl Marx. Karl Marx saw that we lived in this globalized world, that capital was, as he said, summoning whole populations out of the ground and consigning others to oblivion. You know, international investment in railroads and all these things that were, it basically comes down to this: cities invent and reinvent the rural world. The stronger cities get, I mean, the more economically sophisticated and robust, the more they can do that. And what Jacob said is, when cities act outside their own immediate hinterlands, their city forces join up with the city forces of other cities. And so, from the standpoint, let's say, of Saudi Arabia, all the cities of the world are one city and they want one thing, and that is oil.
Mhm.
But Jacobs gives you, I mean, this is her Cities and the Wealth of Nations in 1982, 83. She wrote that. She says, look, in late medieval Europe, all the cities of Europe wanted one thing from Sardinia, and that was it. And they wanted cheese. And so this idea of, various cities joining up to invent collectively and in an unorganized, Adam Smith bottom up way to invent and reinvent the rural world, it's not sustainable. A human being can't live comfortably, normally, with dignity in a region of the world that is being so roughly and crudely invented and reinvented by distant cities.
Yes.
It's just not possible. And that's why people from those regions get the heck out and they go to the city world
Mhm.
to try to in other words, from an ethical perspective, our agency as lone actors needs to be amplified by living in a city with agency. But a city without a currency is a city with no agency.
Mhm.
And therefore its political life is fictional, or it's tentative or tendentious. I mean, depending.
Mhm. What is Christianity in general and Orthodox Christianity in particular says about our quest for agency, for significance, for identity?
I think we attain agency through the embrace of the cross of Christ. And so it's a paradox. We attain agency by living self-sacrificially for others. That's the sort of the short answer. Um, Whereas if we persist in modes of self-love, and self-love is a technical term for Orthodox spirituality, it means sort of like I'm trapped in the miasma of self-concern, self-regard, constantly pitying the self, analyzing the self, unable to discipline the self, right? Um, then our agency, is degraded, and is degraded at becomes an addiction or just becomes impotent.
Mhm.
Yeah. But we are certainly summoned to grow in agency, and the evidence of this is the way that the saints worked miracles in the Holy Spirit. So their agency was amplified by the grace of God. But it came, the price of that agency was to embrace the cross of Christ. In other words, to live self-sacrificially for others. So it's the opposite of today's political thing that, oh, my agency has been threatened by past oppression. And now the answer is sort of a mixture of revenge or reparations. No, the way to recover our agency is to begin to live more and more self-sacrificially for others. That's how everything else is just a kind of, it's fake. It's a fake agency.
Mhm. To what extent is the image of the cross well, beautiful?
Um, yeah, Jonathan Peugeot asked me that, on a podcast a couple of weeks ago. Look, uh, your being crucified for me is very beautiful. My being crucified, you know, it depends. It depends um, because one of the reasons Christ came, you know, he saved the world, not me. His cross was unique. I embrace it, but in the light of my baptism, in the light of the Eucharist, my embrace of self-sacrificial love is usually not devoid of a certain sweetness, even at the moment. So even my own cross, is not. Now there are other things, there are events in life that are ugly, but the kind of ugly that is from evil, is not exactly the cross, right? It's something else.
Yeah, and I suppose the cross's purpose is to degrade and dehumanize the individual who happens to be on it. And in some
Sure, sure.
ways, Christ,
That's the original purpose. Yeah, of course.
in some ways, yeah, I believe Christ redeems the ugliness of the cross, and now
He
we,
infuses it with something more.
Mhm, yes, and I wonder, in your beauty first approach to ethics, can beauty in a Christ-like fashion redeem ugliness?
I mean, there's different kinds of ugliness, right? There's just sort of, bad design, things like that. But then there's, outright malevolence. Um, God redeems things, I think. I think if we keep our focus on his love for us, then 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 we give him the space. We freely create, we freely consent to his working in us to convert ugly situations into beautiful ones. Now, having said that, we cannot sometimes predict ahead of time what will be the total bill due. Like, do I have to give my very life? Some saints, were tortured excessively, and um, the torture is not in itself a beautiful thing, but it becomes encompassed in within a greater beauty.
I suppose that's what the significance of martyrdom is, right? To redeem a certain ugliness in that kind of death.
Um, I mean, very generally, we can say, the purpose of liturgy is to convert chaos into cosmos. So Christ's liturgy on the cross converted chaos into cosmos. Now, chaos, is a broad term, and like I said, it can include outright malevolence, just to, really bad, dumb design choices that people make, and lots of other things too. Um, and chaos, in information theory, chaos has two kind of extreme presentations. One is sheer randomness, and the other is sheer sameness. In both of these instances, sheer sameness or sheer randomness, there is little or no information present. So liturgy takes either monotony or chaos and converts it into cosmos. It converts chaos into cosmos. And in so doing, or by the way it does that, is by infusing logos and information into and meaning into the world. So people are talking about a meaning crisis, and what that means in practice is that people lurch from sheer randomness, or a kind of random belief about the chaos, I mean, the suffering in the world, to the sheer monotony of their self-gratification. Both of those, to live in either one, and most people kind of live in both, is to live in an information-free world. And the job of liturgy and the sacraments, is to convert both those kinds of chaos into cosmos. And that's the theme of chapter 6 of the Ethics of Beauty, that when that happens, when cosmos arises, it provides a kind of shade from the withering heat of oppressive chaos. We cannot live in chaos. Now, to go back to this globalism thing, if you're living in a part of the world that's invented and reinvented by the big city folk of your own country or some other country, or of no country, just sort of many countries, then this is a kind of chaos. It's kind of randomness interspersed with monotony. This is not a cosmos. And people experience, all kinds of feelings. I mean, I wouldn't privilege anger. I don't think anger is the thing. I mean, what's happening in flyover country is that hundreds of thousands of people are dying from heroin overdoses and from meth overdoses and from all these things. It's not rage, it's just death. It's oblivion. And it would be nice if any politician wanted to notice that, other than, I mean, the big goofball Trump, but he did notice it. So we really are in a situation, where um, any of the elites. I mean, I think this Bobby Kennedy Jr., is that his name? Who's running for president. I mean, he's a person who should be talking about this more. But it's hard. It's hard for people to overcome. To succeed in the city, it helps to be blind to non-cityness. It helps you if you are, you get along easier with others if you're blind in the same way that everyone else is. But nations, cannot endure that way. Eventually, leaders have to arise to reconcile the city and the country and the city space and the non-city space.
Yeah, and when I think about Robert Kennedy Jr., I find it quite funny because the premier anti-establishment figure of American political life right now happens to be the heir to one of the biggest and most established political families. Yeah.
Well, certainly it's a family that, was an upstart family once,
Mhm.
and arose to prominence in the 60s through that very rebelliousness, and which, if it is ever to recover its power, would have to be even more open-minded than he already is. And even more plain spoken, I would say, than he already is. And he does well, I think. I'm just saying he's got a ways to go.
Um, of course, following the theme of globalization, I always go back to the example or the story of the Tower of Babel when I think about the globalization process.
Yes.
Humans have tried this before. The way I see it, the Tower of Babel represents an attempt to create order by subverting another, perhaps higher order, that of God. We try to construct one people, one language, and we've erected this tower in order to prove that we could do that. But God didn't find that very flattering, and he did not approve of it at all. And we speak different languages, and perhaps God see that as good. It's good that we are different people, and we have different customs, traditions, and cultures, perhaps. And but onto your point about the cosmos and how a functioning order must accommodate these certain differences. So I wonder, how do you see the Tower of Babel?
Well, of course, Pentecost is the sort of reversal of Babel.
Mhm.
And even though the languages remain multiplied, people can hear the gospel. They can hear, one message.
Mhm.
Um, I think, I mean, maybe politically, the Tower of Babel is like the nation state, and Pentecost is more like the empire. But it's not the empire as we tend to think of it. It's the empire conceived as a sort of a benevolent family of nations, where within an empire, many ethnicities, many religions, many possibilities are welcome. Within a nation state, everyone's welcome as an individual, but they are required to atomize into this new, homogeneity, this new melting pot. And obviously, empires can be quite cruel. I'm just saying that um, empires excelled in actual diversity. They versus, we pay lip service to diversity, but really everyone's got to think the same and be the same public religion of whatever that is, secularism or something. Um, so, but having said that, I mean, Pentecost is an image of the church for me. I mean, I think for the church, it's an image of the church. It's it's meant in first century Palestine to suggest Rome, right? It's meant to suggest Rome, which is this overarching umbrella under which much diversity could exist and flourish. Um, but nothing is, back to what you said about the Tower of Babel. We can't build an order without God. We can't build a civilization without miracle. We cannot build social peace without love. And our modern thinkers are trying to give us a system that can run without love, without miracle, and without God. This is scientifically impossible. And so, we swerve from one violence to another.
I find it so fascinating and so interesting that many of us who are historically inclined are interested in the studies of empires, Roman, Greek, British, you name it. But as individuals, as citizens, we would prefer to reside under nation states. And um, I wonder, is it because of the um, influence of modernity on us, or is is it another extension of our quest for agency?
I think it's the latter. What's going on is that in politics is that you always have a tension between unity and diversity. And this is a tension that's resolved in the Holy Trinity and in the church and nowhere else. I mean, only love can sustain diversity and unity, unity and diversity. So when we have, let's say we're part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and we have a certain measure of unity and diversity, we feel that our diversity is not being respected. So we hunger to be an independent nation. The moment we become that independent nation, now we realize that we've lost the unity and we're at war with everyone else. So now we go back to the other extreme and we have the European Union or NATO. So the human mind and the human experience is always going to just oscillate between unity and diversity. It's only in God, and only through some kind of really wise statesmanship that you could make unity and diversity coincide. And then, of course, the mass media doesn't help, right? Because its business model is conflict. It's monetizing, what we call in Orthodoxy the passions, lust and anger and curiosity, the three kind of parts of the soul, the tripartite soul. And as it does so, it's always going to make us feel discontent with our lot in life. So whether we are in the EU or out of it, whether we are, part of the British Empire or we're independent, Bangladesh, the media will constantly feed us, anger and lust and curiosity for something better.
I suppose one of the beauties of the church that I belong to, the Catholic Church, is that whenever I go to Mass in any church, wherever I go, I see people from various different backgrounds,
Yes.
i.e. national and ethnic. And I'm harking back to that epistle of Paul in which he says there are no Jews, no Greeks, no man, no woman, for we are all children under God. And I think that love of God is something that, yeah, because I share with many different Catholics, our nationalities and ethnicities do not seem to matter as much as the fact that we are all part of the same church. And I wonder, why and how do, I guess, more secular organizations, as you've mentioned, the EU, NATO, or even the UN, fail to emulate this sort of brotherly unity.
Well, because that brotherly unity is miraculous. It's a gift of the Holy Spirit. No political entity can. We can learn from the church, and we can try to some of the practical solutions can be applied that are discovered by the church, and we can experiment on our own. But no, I mean it's just politics. It's just the world. I mean, look at it this way: you go into church, and let's say you feel a brotherhood and a sisterhood with everyone there. But if you were a parent, you wouldn't be at peace if your child just picks someone new to go home with for the week every week. So it does not obliterate, our anchor in our bodies, our cultures, our ethnicities. And I think that the impact in the United States of obliterating cultural distinction, downstream has also been to obliterate family loyalty. And so the individual is freer, but also the individual is no longer tethered or supported. But I'm not trying to say, oh, social decline, everything stinks. What I'm trying to say is that the tension between diversity and unity can only be overcome through supernatural means. It's not and through those political systems which kind of voluntarily participate in the divine, the U.S. Constitution being one. But no, it's just tough. I mean, we used to have stronger families in this country, but before Vatican II, Catholic kids were told to enter a Baptist church would be to risk damnation, just not even during a service. So now, we've lowered those firewalls. We don't have that, but we find that something more needs to replace those firewalls. And what is it? And the family is declining, and like most academics, I mean, I think all academics, who really think about things, I think are broadly speaking persuaded by Karl Marx's observation that economic arrangements, are often decisive over everything else, over family, culture, language, religion. And the fact that our economies fling us to and fro, it's hard for any amount of religion or culture to push back at that. The countries where it does push back at like that, Europe, is countries where they've just said, okay, we're not going to take capitalism all the way, right? But that's not what we're saying in America.
Yes, Marx's lasting impact on how we conduct discourse on these matters, I think, is that he seems to put the economy and economic well-being or economic conflict on an unreasonably high pedestal. He thinks that is the only thing that matters, and that is the only thing that determines the health of a culture or health of a polity. And I always thought that the antithesis of Marx came, well, some 100 years before him, and that being Burke. It can be argued that Burke has a beauty first approach to ethics. He has this one wonderful treatise on on beauty and such. But and of course,
yes, the conservatives have the closest to a kind of beautiful vision. It's that holistic, but they don't have a science of economics, and neither did Marx.
Yeah. Yes.
Neither does anyone, as far as I can tell. Everyone is kind of. But no, you're right. I mean, Russell Kirk. I mean, these people. the thing is that I think from an Orthodox perspective, what we would say that the trouble with the conservative movements is that they they rely too much on ethics and not enough on ontology. They don't really, they have a sense, there's a moralistic sense. Whereas I think, the liberal retort to many conservative views is, yeah, but in reality, someone's getting exploited, and all you can say is, wave the flag a little higher. And I think that's, the liberals have their eye on the ontology a little more.
Yes. I suppose one of the challenges for the conservatives in any part of the world is we tend to be more defensive when it comes to dodging or retorting against certain attacks by liberals, leftists, and people alike. And one of the things that conservatives, I think, have failed to do, but I think there have been improvements in this front, is that we've struggled to come up with an alternative framework of ethics and culture that is in some ways different from that of what the liberals and the leftists offer us.
Well, liberalism, is as it's currently lived. I mean, it's progressivism is. I mean, in certain respects, it's closer to the prevailing Gnosticism of our age, so that gives it an edge in public understanding and sympathy. But I don't I don't know. I just think you need spokespeople, on your side who are good. Look, Trump had every opportunity. He was president. I mean, had he spoken like a normal human being, he could have consolidated, his support. The people want that. They want a leader who can speak and who can display some capacity for self-restraint and wisdom, and yeah.
So finally, I'd like to address the prevalence of iconography within the Orthodox tradition. And one particular figure in mind I would like to bring up is Andrei Rublev, which you've mentioned extensively in the chapter. I recently had a chance to watch the Tarkovsky movie on Rublev, and that's one of the most magnificent films I've ever seen. And in your view, what are some of the drives that motivated Rublev's ethics and, if I can say it, artistry?
Well, I don't know his biography well. I mean, what I mentioned in the book is, I used to be, before this war started, a regular visitor to Moscow, and a pilgrim there, and I would always go to the Tretyakov. I guess just last week or just this week, the Rublev's Trinity icon was transferred from the museum back to Sergei Posad, to the monastery for which it was painted. I think permanently, apparently. But anyway, in my day, you just went to the Tretyakov and you paid your $15 or whatever it was, $30, I don't remember, and you'd wander up there, and every 5-10 minutes, one person comes by, but essentially you can just sit on the bench there and be alone with the icon. It's a phenomenally, what I write about in the book is that what surprised me about the experience of the icon is that it's was a sense of relief in its presence. Like, it is not, if there is ego in that painting, it's some other kind of ego than what I know in my culture. It is there's an absolute openness in purity in the soul of the painter that comes through in this work of art. So how a man, a man or a woman, how a person ascends to that, or I think certainly the worship of Christ, done properly, can implant in a person the vision that this is the way to be, that this is the path to salvation, to love, so self-emptyingly. And then certainly the life of an Orthodox monk is built, to cultivate that. But you can see there is, the artist's passion there, the artist's desire, and that zeal, maybe is a better word, that to get it right. Yeah, I don't, we say that we're created in the image of God, okay, and then collectively we're created in the image of the Trinity, let's say, and that goes to this political thing of unity versus diversity. But individually, we're created in the image of Christ, and not only of Christ, but of Him crucified. And that is our destiny, is to assimilate His crucifixion into our lives, to join ourselves to His crucifixion for the life of the world. That's where that is the direction in which we'll find our peace. And that painting seems to have been someone who, found his peace in that life, in that way of the cross. And now that it's done, now that it's been done for, I don't know, is it 6 centuries? I don't know my history that well. It offers the same to anyone who sees it. And it's like a vision of Christ, and in the sense that, Christ said, come to me, for I am humble and meek of heart. Ye who labor and are weary, come to me and find rest. And I think Christianity and Christ offer that rest to people. And that's why I don't feel in myself a particular urgency about the decline of my civilization, or the mistake of one or the other political parties. I understand that it's hard to get things right. It's just is really objectively hard. If I were running for office, if I were making policy, I would be struggling too. So I'm not inclined to condemn, but I am inclined, through my own writings and my teaching at the seminary, my deanship of Hellenic College, to summon people to find their peace and their haven in Christ, and not in the Sunday paper. I don't know.
Oh, well, I think that's a very good note to end on. Thank you very much, Tim Patitsas, for joining the show.
Thank you so much, Chuang.